I've picked 16 countries that I think would perform best at a Valorant World Cup, made a team of pros for each one, and put them in a tier list to try and predict the winners. You might have seen this graphic floating around on Twitter with possible teams on it, but we won't be using that. I mean, they have Zoms on the Brazil team, a player who's 1, not even Brazilian, and 2, known for calling them shit. Do we want him to die? Another thing is the teams in this video will only be allowed a maximum of 3 players from the same regular team. I'm basing this off the teams for next year, so old teams that were split up, like the champions winning Loud roster, don't have any restrictions. I did consider the roles and tried to give each team an IGL, but remember, this is all for fun. With that out of the way, let's get into it. The only team in the D tier for me is Spain. Most other countries have at least 1 or 2 superstar players, but they just aren't the same top level players from the Spanish region. In the end, I went with Mixwell, Quiles, Coldamenta, Lowell and Fatinho. A solid team, sure, but when you look at the other teams in this video, they simply don't compare. Coldamenta is a great IGL, and Quiles is technically a Champions winner, but he was probably the weakest Ascend player in that tournament, so they're in the D tier. It might surprise some to see a team with 2 Paper X players this low on the tier list, but like I said before, just wait and see some of these other teams. For Indonesia, I chose Forsaken, Mindfreak, Elmimore, Flipshitter and Blaze King. The reason Indonesia is below other APAC regions here is because of their lack of structure. Forsaken is a cracked duelist, of course, but without the setups he normally has on Paper X, I don't see him performing to the same level. He'd probably just start jet dashing into 6 players, kill 2 and then die in the first 10 seconds or something. Mindfreak could pull out some ridiculous clutches, but I don't think that'd be enough to take them very far. The other team in the C tier is Thailand. This team will probably be familiar to a lot of you, as every player was on Xerxia at some point. Scary, Patapan, Cruz, Foxy and Surf. I think this team could do some serious damage, but not reach a high placement. The synergy that's already formed between the players would give them an advantage, but they got outclassed at every international event in 2022, not making it out of groups a single time. I fear they might face the same exit in a World Cup event, so they're in my C tier. The other 2 Paper X players in this competition are in the Singapore team. Despite being the smallest country at this event by area, they just make it into my B tier. This team would be made up of Benkai, Jing, Retler, Juicy and Derion. In other words, Benkai, Jing and Bleed. I mentioned a lack of structure as a reason for not putting Indonesia higher, but a great IGL in Benkai would give this team that structure, and Jing is probably the greatest player to come out of Asia in Valorant, so could probably win games just by himself. With the young stars of Bleed filling out the team, I think they could get some upsets and end with a respectable placement. As long as Benkai has some stupid walkouts, I don't even care what they get. Some fans struggle to name players for a Polish squad, but when you actually think about it, their roster has some serious firepower. I went with Starkzo, Zeke, Baddy G, Molsi and Patatek, a roster with 2 champions winners, one of the most underrated players in EU with Molsi, Baddy G who kinda carried FPX as a sub earlier this year, and FPX veteran Patatek. There's no real weak links in this roster, although the lack of a clear IGL between Starkzo and Zeke could cost them, but I can see them playing well at a Valorant World Cup. It's a shame that we can't have every player from the Zeta division on the Japanese squad, but the 3 I did pick were Sugar Zero, Laz and Deb, adding Zinfree and Fisker to round out the team. Sugar Zero and Laz are the clear stars of this team, and this team spirit that Laz provides as an IGL will only bring up the other players. Zinfree was a top performer on Northeption and Fisker is a very experienced player, so in a LAN environment he'd be a good presence. There's so many different combinations for the Japanese roster I could have picked, but I think they'd do well anyway and pull off some upsets. Then it'll feel just like the real World Cup. The UK team has a solid tier 1 base, with a surprise star player that pushes them to the top of B tier. Boaster, Link, Mystic, Soulcast and Ardis. Ardis is originally Latvian, but grew up in Liverpool, so he counts for the UK team. I mean, just listen to him.
Nah, to be honest, I played this event. Last 3 games I played like a dog, yeah.
But he gives the team the star power they need. With a tactical IGL leading them in Boaster, he can also harness the talents of Link, Soulcast and Mystic to take this team to a good finish. They don't quite have enough firepower to bring them any higher though, like the teams we'll look at next. Chamber was recently heavily nerfed, and I think that could make the Finland team slightly worse. Their lineup is still cracked though, with Bone Cold, Durka, Yampi, Hoodie and Hyber. Obviously Durka and Yampi are the heavy hitters here, but it's very easy to underrate Bone Cold and Hoodie, who are key players in their respective teams. I see this team playing with great individual skill, but failing to win over teams with more strategic depth. And one of those teams in my mind is Sweden. With Zipan, Meadow, Safe, Leo and Maxi, this is a lineup with some of the best support players in Europe. In terms of franchising, there's a Fnatic, Liquid and Na'Vi player on this team, which is pretty scary. I chose Maxi from the old Bleed roster as the final player on Smokes, and I think he'd fit in well here. This team seems like it'd be a consistent force in this tournament, but I don't know if they have the players to break into the S tier. Turkey up here is a bit of a punt from me, but a mix of top level Valorant players and tier 2 demons would work well in this setting. CNED, Alphayer, Woot, Power and Jailers is the team I chose. CNED and Alphayer don't need much explanation as to why they're in this team. They're by far 2 of the best players to come out of the Turkish Valorant scene. Power was a standout on BBL and SMB, and Woot and Jailers look like the most promising prodigies in Turkey right now. You might be asking, who is Woot? In math, he is my solution. In history, he is my king. And in the G-Loot Valorant clash, he is my GOAT.
Who is this Woot guy? He's crazy.
The team at the top of the A tier is a very familiar one. Using some sneaky roster moves, you can actually just construct the entire old Leviathan roster. Taco Leah, Shy, King, Melsa, and Adverso. This team would have the best possible synergy out of any in this tournament, which is a huge advantage, and they'd be able to use all of their strats from 2022. They put up good performances in Copenhagen and Istanbul, so they top off the A tier for me. Now we're into the S tier, we start to get rosters that are genuine super teams. The least of these super teams in my opinion is Canada. With FNS, Marved, tenz, Jonah P and Nismo, this is a deadly combination of tier 1 pros from the NA scene. The duo of FNS and Marved is obviously scary, and combined with tenz, they could use similar strategies to when they had Ye on Optic to maximise his potential. To complete the roster, I chose Jonah P and Nismo, two players who each had strong performances in NA Challengers in 2022, and also players who can play many different roles to a high level, which is super important in a tournament like this. I mentioned earlier that Korea couldn't just have the entire DRX team, but they can still take 3 of those players, so I went with Marco, Stax and Buzz from DRX, and Zeta and Meteor as the other 2 players. Even though this isn't the entirety of DRX, it's still a Korean super team, and I can see them running over other teams with the double duelists in Meteor and Buzz. Mako is arguably the best smokes player in the world, and Stax has a shout for best initiator, and Zeta is a solid fill player for this team too. In a perfect DRX world, they'd probably be rated a bit higher, but this is still a top placement. The US make their appearance at number 3 on the list with a frankly insane team: Ye, Crashies, Vanity, Zekken and Trent. Another Optic duo make an international team in Ye and Crashies, but when they're arguably the best player in the world and the best initiator in the world, it's kind of a no-brainer. There's not many US IGLs better than Vanity right now, so I went with him for that slot, and that only leaves Entry and another initiator. I decided on Zekken for the entry player, one of the most promising young players going into 2023, and Trent for the second initiator, because, well, I'm completely biased towards my favourite player. Glad I cleared that up. Brazil have Loud, who literally just won Champions. That should make them number 1, right? Well, not quite. Sacy, Pancada, Les Aspas, and not Sadak because he's Argentinian. To replace him, I went with Jandy, a well-known, cracked Brazilian player. This is an incredible team, we all know that, but there's one more team we haven't considered yet. My top team in this video is the only team made up entirely of Masters winning players. You might have predicted this by now, but Russia's World Cup team is incredible. Nats, Redgar, Shao, Sigetsu, and Chronicle. There's not a single weak link in this roster. Every player has been considered one of the best in the world at some point. If this team came together for a World Cup tournament, there's no doubt we'd be watching some brilliant Valorant. And so that's all of my teams for a Valorant World Cup ranked from S tier to D. I'd love to see a tournament like this, but we'll have to wait and see if Riot does one. Let me know if you agree with my list or if you think India should have been in the number 1 spot down below. I've been Commend, subscribe if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.